Alright, let's talk about Standard 18, Substandard B. Explain the Wagner Act and the rise of industrial unionism. This term here is going to be very important. The rise of industrial unionism is very important for the EOCT. The Wagner Act is also very important to understand for the EOCT. The Wagner Act, let's get some background first. During the Red Scare of the 1920s that we talked about, the Bolshevik Revolution, the spread of communism in Russia, and the scare in the United States of it being here, led to a Red Scare. And during this Red Scare, unions or labor unions where workers joined together and kind of demanded from their employers certain conditions to be met. And we call that collective bargaining. It's where they collectively get together and then bargain out this deals or negotiate deals with their employers. Things like 8-hour workday, 40-hour work week, minimum wage, those types of things. Slow down production line, whatever it is. Workers feel like they're being done wrongly in. But during the Red Scare, the number of unions, the percentage of people in unions and the number of unions decreased. Right here you see Red Scare was above 10%, and it dropped all the way down to like 5% labor unions during the Red Scare movement, because being in a union was considered communist, anti-business, un-American during the Red Scare, and a lot of industries did a lot of discriminating things for people who joined these unions that wanted to collectively bargain. Worst thing they did was they fired them permanently. They could never come back. They fired the workers for joining unions. Other things, they could reduce their hours until they quit, or put them in high demanding jobs where it was so labor intensive they couldn't handle it. They quit, went home. And these businesses and companies also created their own company unions that was anti-union pretty much, and they had their workers join those unions to try to keep them from joining others, to keep them from collective bargaining or demanding better things for themselves as workers. These are the things going on during the Red Scare, and that's why there's a decline in the number of labor unions. During the New Deal, FDR and Frances Perkins, Department of Labor, the first woman ever put on within the cabinet, and this guy here, U.S. Senator Robert Wagner, pushed through Congress the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act is named after, it's a law, an act here, went through the legislature, a bill that becomes a law is called an act. We talked about that before. The Wagner Act was named after Robert Wagner, the sponsor of the bill. And it's also called the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA, National Labor Relations Act. And it went into effect July 6, 1935. And what it is going to do is it's going to protect workers' rights to unionize. In other words, their right to form a union or to join a union of their choice. And so, in effect, it establishes collective bargaining rights for workers. Workers' right to get together, combine themselves in a group, and then bargain what they think they want from their employer. So this act is going to put the protection of the federal government behind workers, behind laborers, and protect them from these unfair practices by these businesses going on during the Red Scare. And to keep them from organizing. So in a sense, the National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, Wagner Act, is going to prohibit unfair practices like intimidating workers if they join a union, to prevent them from joining a union, or tempt them from organizing a union or joining another union. In other words, forcing them to join the corporate union, or firing them altogether, reducing their hours. Anything that was intimidating or tried to keep these workers from doing it. And then the NLRA set up an agency called the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. There were 3 members on the board, but they would administer over it, and they had officials that would go into these factories and into these industrial settings and do a secret survey or if workers themselves wanted to come before the board and testify about unfair labor practices within an industry, then they could definitely do that. When this NLRB would send officials in, and they would try to get the managers out of the room and the owners away from the workers, and then they would survey the workers to see how they were being treated, and the workers could testify to them. And then sometimes the NLRB could fine a company or industry for carrying out unfair labor practice, but it's also go in and hold these elections where these workers could choose which union they wanted to be a part of. So the federal government comes in and protects these workers and helps them, if they want to, form their own unions without being threatened for termination. So it went before the Supreme Court after businesses and industries challenged the NLRA and Wagner Act, and the Supreme Court upheld the law as constitutional, upheld FDR's and Congress's Wagner Act as perfectly constitutional and okay. Now what's going to happen here on this, you see the downward decrease in unions with the Red Scare, but after the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act, is passed and goes into effect, what happens is a sharp increase upward of the number of people in unions, the percentage of unions created, and the number of people within those unions is going to skyrocket. This is basically a picture of industrial unionism. In industries all across the United States, unions are going to be formed. So industrial unionism in that sense refers to that. Let's look at a different picture. So industrial unionism, to me, and there's two different meanings really, but I think in the spirit of what we're learning, industrial unionism refers to industries, the rise of unions within the United States and industries across the nation. That's the way I see what the meaning of industrial unionism means. And the Wagner Act is going to cause this. The NLRA is going to cause industrial unionism within the United States. 1935, when the Wagner Act was passed, there were 3.7 million members in unions. And as a result of the passage of this act, it's going to increase. And within 10 years, it's going to quadruple to 14.8 million union members, and just going to stagger off here from 45 to 50, but then pick up after 1950. Okay, so that's industrial unionism. To me, that's what it means. Although some people could argue, experts argue, that when we say industrial unionism, we're talking about the structure of unions. And what we mean by that is, under the Knights of Labor, the first really national union in the United States, KOL, Knights of Labor, the leader there was Terence Powderly. This union accepted anybody that wanted to be a part of it. They had a loose organization, so any workers at all, whether they're skilled or unskilled, could join this union. But it was so loose of an organization that even the employers themselves, even the industries and corporations where these workers worked, could join these unions under the Knights of Labor. But the Knights of Labor was really more of a socialist movement. More than it was a labor union. And see, this kind of evolved into, or was replaced by, the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, that we talked about. And under Samuel Gompers, it was a union, the AFL was a union for craft unionism. In other words, only skilled workers with a skill set could join this union. They really did not, they excluded unskilled workers. So in the evolution of unions, industrial unionism refers to the creation of a union that included both skilled and unskilled workers, and it excluded the employers, the industries and corporations themselves. But Samuel Gompers' AFL was about bread and butter issues, wage an hour, 40-hour work week, safe working conditions, that sort of thing. This kind of transfers over into this, but we have a union of both skilled and unskilled union workers, so it could be interpreted as that as well. But looking at unions and strikes and this agitated thing between workers and laborers and the people they work for, Henry Ford's Ford Motor Company was hit hard by the Great Depression, because Americans were not buying Ford cars. We talked before about Hoover wagons, how People couldn't afford the gas to put in the cars, much less a lot of people couldn't afford the cars themselves. They hooked their horses to their old ones and drug them along, but they couldn't afford the parts either. So Henry Ford's going to be hit hard by the Great Depression. So what he's going to do in reaction to that is he's going to close a lot of his factories. I think he closes one in Dearborn, Michigan. And then he lays off a bunch of workers too. And this goes to that underconsumption thing about people losing their jobs and widespread unemployment. But he's also going to drop wages. You know, Henry Ford had been known when he first opened the business to pay his employers $5 a day. But during the Great Depression, he's going to drop that down to 50 cents a day. Regardless of what you were being paid, that's what you'd get, is 50 cents a day. And he also increased the speed of the lines that were left. And a lot of workers felt a lot of stress and felt like it was unsafe to work under those conditions. Every second meant something. And here's a video showing some of the workers of the 30s and 40s that went to industrialize in the Ford Motor Company. It was one of the last to industrialize. GM and Chevrolet actually did before they did. But let's look at this video real quick.
And told us we were working for 50 cents an hour, no matter what you were making. If you were making $1 an hour, you went down to 50 cents an hour.
Workers on the Rouge lines had never had job security. Now those lucky enough still to have jobs became increasingly powerless.
You couldn't even talk to guys on the job. Not to let the foreman see you. There were whispering going on and whatnot. By a friend of mine was fired 3 times, a guy by the name of John Gallo, for smiling. If you went to the bathroom, you had to get permission from your supervisor. And if you was in there over 3 or 4 minutes, you would had one of the service guys, if you had to use the bathroom to relieve your bowels, he would come up and put his foot where you first, and he says, stand up. And if when you stand up, if there wasn't something in that toilet, out you go.
Conditions became so bad at the Rouge that workers began listening to recruiters urging them to join something most of them had never even heard of, a union.
I met a guy by the name of Bill Mackay, and he says, we're going to get a union in this place. What the hell is a union, you know? I said, well, these foremen won't have to be standing over, but anyway, Bill gave me some literature, and he said, don't let anybody see this, put it in your pocket, and read it when you get home, you know. And I put it in my shirt pocket. Later on, I went home that next morning, went to reading about it and everything. So that's how I got involved in the union.
But in a city already devastated by unemployment, union organizers found recruiting difficult. Then, early in 1932, the Rouge shut down completely, triggering an event that would change everything.
Out of many meetings and many discussions, it was decided that they would have a hunger march on Ford to let Ford know that he'd promised us $5 a day, and he'd close the plant without any explanation whatsoever. They marched through Detroit. In fact, gave us police escort all the way to the Dearborn boundary. And when we got there, we were told that we could not march any farther.
When we got to this corner here, Miller and Dix, the fireworks started. Hoses started to pour ice water on top of us, and it was a cordon of police right across Miller Road proper, acting as a barricade. Right in this spot in here, piles of coal, and some of the people got on top of the piles of coal, and they threw the coals back at the police and at the company people on the other side of the fence. The march went on towards Gate 3, and that's where men were shot. Instead of getting jobs, we got lead, we got bullets, blood.
4 demonstrators were shot dead by police outside the Ford plant. The Miller Road Martyrs, as they were called, helped draw public attention to the auto workers' case. Washington backed them as well, after the Democrats regained power in 1933. Roosevelt's New Deal gave workers the legal right to have collective bargaining.
That's Wagner
And in
Act, National Labor
1937,
Relations
the Auto
Act.
Workers Union felt strong enough to take on the car companies. After a brief strike, the union was finally recognized by General Motors and Chrysler. Only Henry Ford held out. The union's tactics grew bolder.
The union had a 1914 Model T Ford with a brass radiator on it, and had a great big sign on the top of it. It said, "More modern than Ford's labor policy." And I was driving it this day. We got up to the old administration building where Ford had its office, and I accidentally on purpose stalled it right in the driveway.
Jim Sullivan's demonstration was one of many as UAW recruiters stepped up their efforts. But it would take 3 more years before the union felt strong enough to stage a confrontation at Ford. In 1941, in the urgent atmosphere of World War, the showdown came.
Look at this Wagner Act
After a
sign.
fight broke out between a foreman and a worker, Jim Sullivan felt the moment had arrived.
So I went back and made my call. I told Mike Whitman, I said, "Mike, it's now or never. They're ready. I can take them out."
One of my first acts was to go up and push a red button to stop the line. I had a foreman named Jim Barbery. He rushed over to, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" So strike, strike. Everybody went to holler, strike, strike, strike.
The world's largest automobile plant ground to a halt.
I felt real good. I said, boy, I really done a job, you know. I was dancing the jig. I made history. I shut down the Ford Motor Company.
It was one of the moments of my life that I'll never forget, to see people walking out on Miller Road and everybody grabbing each other and hollering and hugging each other. And I don't think Ford himself, wherever he is, whether he's in hell or heaven, will ever forget that day.
After the strike, the union had a legal contract with the company. Changes to the speed of the line and work practices were to be jointly negotiated. The Ford contract soon became a model for the rest of American industry.